So graphing a quadratic inequality is just like graphing a quadratic, but instead of just stopping with the quadratic, you're going to have to do some shading. And so we start by finding the axis of symmetry. So I'll start with this first one. The axis of symmetry at x equals -2 over 2 times a. So we get -1. So then I graph that. There's my -1. I find my vertex, so I'm going to plug in -1. So I get -1 squared is 1. Plus 2 times -1 is -1 minus 1. That gives me -1. Okay, then we find some other points. So we found that we got -1, -1. I'm going to plug in 0. That'll give me -1, which is a problem, so I made a mistake somewhere. So let's see here. Plug in -b over 2 times a. I get -1. That's good. When I plug in -1, oh, this should be a -2 right here. So I should have gotten -2. And I should make that a -2 there. All right, it happens to all of us. All right, so I plug in 0 and I get -1 because when you look up here, if I plug in 0, those cancel out and I just get that -1. Okay, so let's see here. And then I can reciprocate. I've got the -2 over there, so I've got -2, -1. And then I want to plug in another number. If I plug in 1, I get 1 plus 2 minus 1. That's 3. That gives me 2. Okay, so there are my points. Find the other point. Now, I want to graph it. I'm looking here and I see that it's got a line underneath, which means I can make it a solid parabola. And then it says it's greater than. So if I go to my vertex, the y value gets bigger when I go up. So you notice the arrow's inside the parabola. That means I'm going to shade inside the parabola. And that's pretty much it. Now, of course, the shading can go elsewhere too. So if I do this other one, let's say I have the axis of symmetry, gives me -b would be a +3 over 2 times 1 would be 2. Ew, why would I pick something like that? Let's change this. I know you can't do that, but I can. So we get b would be a 4 over 2. That gives me 2. Okay. Then I want my vertex. If I plug in 2, I get 2 squared is 4. Minus 4 times 2 is 8 plus 2. That's going to give me -2. So on my table, I've got +2, -2. Okay, then I plug in, let's plug in 0. And if I plug in 0, I just get a +2. And I can reflect that. I'm 2 away, so I go to the other side. And let's plug in 1. And if I plug in 1, I get 1 minus 4 plus 2. That gives me -1. And reflect. Now this one, if I look at that, it says that it's just less than. So that means I have to do a dotted parabola, just like we did a dotted line when we graphed inequalities of lines. So it's a dotted parabola. And then it says it's less than. So less than, if I go to the vertex, less than is below. So I'm going to have to shade below the parabola, which is kind of like saying you're shading outside the parabola. But it's below the parabola no matter where you are. And that is graphing quadratic inequalities.